It is the 4th of January, 1969, somewhere on the gravel plains north of the Dhofar Mountains in southern Oman. The sun has not yet cleared the horizon, and the air still carries the chill of a desert night, though within the hour it will climb past 40 degrees Celsius. 4 vehicles sit low against the flat, colorless ground, their engines ticking as they cool, their crews silent, listening. There is no wind. Somewhere in the distance, a nightjar calls once and falls quiet. The vehicles are painted an odd, almost absurd shade of pink, a color chosen not for spectacle, but for survival, because in the strange light of desert dawn and dusk, pink blends into the land better than any shade of brown or green ever could. Each vehicle carries a general-purpose machine gun mounted above the bonnet, sand channels lashed to the sides, jerry cans of water and fuel stacked wherever space allows, and men of the Special Air Service crouched low, scanning the ridgeline for movement. These are Land Rovers, stripped of doors, windscreens folded flat against the bonnet, built for a war that official maps barely acknowledged. Nobody watching this scene could have guessed that the ungainly, boxy little truck beneath these soldiers, born not from military ambition but from post-war British austerity and a shortage of steel, would go on to become one of the most trusted vehicles ever carried into combat, adopted by more armies, guerrilla movements, and special forces units than almost any military vehicle in history. It began, improbably, as a stopgap. It became something far greater. This is the story of how an unglamorous farm vehicle, designed on a beach in Wales with a sketch scratched into the sand, became the workhorse that special forces around the world would come to depend upon, and in some cases, still do. To understand why the Land Rover became indispensable to elite forces, it helps to understand the vehicle shortage facing Britain after the Second World War. The Rover Company, based in Solihull, found itself in 1947 with a factory built for luxury saloons, but almost no steel allocation to build them, since the government was rationing raw materials toward export industries. Rover's chief designer, Maurice Wilkes, owned a war surplus Jeep that he used on his farm in Anglesey, and when it eventually wore out, he reportedly sketched a replacement in the sand, a simple boxy vehicle built around a tractor-like chassis, powered by a modest engine, and clad in aluminium alloy rather than steel, since aluminium was not subject to the same wartime restrictions. What emerged in 1948, unveiled at the Amsterdam Motor Show, was never intended as a military vehicle at all. It was conceived for farmers, foresters, and colonial administrators, a practical machine that could plow a field in the morning and drive to town in the afternoon. Yet the British Army, still operating a patchwork of aging wartime jeeps and lorries, needed a light, reliable four-wheel drive vehicle capable of operating across the difficult terrain of a shrinking but still vast empire, from the jungles of Malaya to the mountains of Kenya. And the Land Rover's simplicity, low cost, and mechanical honesty made it the obvious choice. Existing military vehicles of the period were either too heavy for guerrilla-style operations, too complex to repair in the field, or simply unavailable in sufficient numbers, since Britain's post-war defense budget could not sustain the vehicle programs of wartime scale. Early military trials in the early 1950s exposed exactly what irregular warfare demanded: a vehicle that 2 soldiers with basic tools could strip down and repair without specialist workshops, that could survive being driven through rivers, salt flats, and volcanic ash, and that could be adapted almost infinitely, fitted with radios, weapons, stretchers, or water tanks, depending on the mission. The Malayan Emergency, beginning in 1948 and lasting until 1960, became an early proving ground, as British and Commonwealth forces pursued communist insurgents through dense jungle where conventional lorries simply could not follow. It was here that Special Forces units, including the newly reformed 22 Special Air Service Regiment, began adapting Land Rovers for long-range patrol work, recognizing that the vehicle's lightweight, narrow track, and short wheelbase allowed it to traverse terrain that would immobilize heavier trucks. The seeds of a much longer relationship between elite soldiers and this unassuming British vehicle had been planted, though few at the time understood how far that relationship would extend. The transformation from farm vehicle to Special Forces workhorse did not happen through a single dramatic redesign, but through years of incremental modification, driven largely by the soldier, became the base platform for what would eventually be nicknamed the Pink Panther, a designation drawn both from its distinctive color scheme and, according to popular if unverified accounts, from the 1963 film of the same name that was popular among troops at the time. The color itself, a pale, almost salmon pink, was developed after trials found that standard sand and khaki paints stood out too sharply during the brief hours of dawn and dusk, when raiding parties were most likely to move, whereas a muted pink blended into the shifting tones of desert rock and haze. Engineering the vehicle for long-range desert patrol work involved a series of practical modifications, carried out largely at the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment and by REME workshops, in close consultation with SAS soldiers returning from operations. The standard canvas roof and doors were removed entirely to save weight and allow rapid dismounting under fire. A rollover bar was fitted above the front seats for crew protection, since the vehicles were frequently driven at speed across broken ground. Extended-range fuel tanks, sometimes doubling standard capacity, were fitted beneath or behind the seats, because patrols might operate hundreds of miles from the nearest resupply point, deep inside Dhofar's Jebel Massif, or along smuggling routes near the Yemeni border. A machine gun mount, typically for a general-purpose machine gun or occasionally twin Browning machine guns, was fitted above the bonnet, giving each vehicle genuine offensive firepower rather than relying solely on the crew's personal weapons. Sand channels, essentially perforated steel plates used to provide traction when a vehicle became bogged in soft sand, were bolted to the sides alongside additional stowage for water, ammunition, and radio equipment. The engine itself remained close to standard, typically a 2.25-liter four-cylinder petrol unit producing around 77 brake horsepower, modest by modern standards, but entirely sufficient given the vehicle's light unladen weight of under 1.5 tons. What made the vehicle remarkable was not raw power, but the combination of mechanical simplicity, an aluminium alloy body resistant to the corrosive effects of salt air and sand, and a robust box-section chassis capable of absorbing punishment that would destroy a more sophisticated design. Production of Land Rovers at the Solihull Works, and later under license at plants across the Commonwealth and beyond, would eventually exceed 1.5 million vehicles across the Series 1, 2, and 3 range alone, figures that gave military planners confidence that spare parts and replacement vehicles would remain available for decades, a critical consideration for any Army planning long-term deployments in remote regions. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. The vehicle's combat record accumulated steadily rather than in a single defining battle, which is itself part of what made it so trusted. In the Dhofar Rebellion, fought in the mountainous southern province of Oman between 1965 and 1975, SAS squadrons working alongside the Sultan's armed forces used Pink Panther Land Rovers to conduct long-range reconnaissance and fighting patrols across terrain where wheeled vehicles had rarely been attempted, supporting the construction of fortified positions along the so-called Hornbeam and Hammer lines intended to sever rebel supply routes from South Yemen. Soldiers who served during the campaign later described the disorienting heat inside the open vehicles, the constant vigilance required on tracks where landmines and ambushes were a daily possibility, and the strange psychological comfort of a machine that, despite its ungainly appearance, rarely failed them mechanically even after weeks of continuous punishment. In the Falklands War of 1982, standard military Land Rovers, though not the specialized Pink Panther variant, supported British forces across East Falklands' boggy, roadless terrain, again demonstrating the vehicle's adaptability across radically different climates. Across the decades, similar vehicles were used by French Foreign Legion units in Chad, by Rhodesian and later Zimbabwean forces, and by numerous other special operations units who valued the same qualities the SAS had identified in Malaya and Arabia, namely simplicity, reliability, and repairability, far from any conventional supply chain. When measured against equivalent vehicles fielded by other nations during the same decades, the Land Rover's distinct character becomes clearer. The American Jeep, its spiritual ancestor from the Second World War, offered comparable off-road capability, but was more powerful vehicles as American doctrine shifted toward mechanized firepower over lightweight mobility. The Soviet GAZ-69, roughly contemporary with the early Land Rover, was mechanically robust and produced in enormous numbers, yet its heavier steel construction and less refined four-wheel drive system made it less suited to the kind of rapid, dispersed patrol work the SAS required, and it saw comparatively limited adoption by dedicated special forces units outside the Warsaw Pact. West Germany's later Volkswagen Iltis and various American high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles developed decades afterward, prioritized protection and payload over the Land Rover's stripped-down simplicity, reflecting a different philosophy of vehicle design that emerged as warfare grew more mechanized and threats such as improvised explosive devices became more prevalent. What distinguished the Land Rover was never outright performance, since its top speed rarely exceeded 100 kilometers per hour, and its power output was modest by any measure. Its advantage lay instead in a philosophy of mechanical honesty, an aluminum body that resisted corrosion better than steel-bodied rivals, and a design so straightforward that soldiers with minimal training could diagnose and repair most faults using tools carried on the vehicle itself. This reliability under austere conditions, historians of military logistics generally agree, mattered more to special operations planners than raw horsepower ever could, since a broken-down vehicle in hostile territory represented not an inconvenience, but a potential catastrophe. The wider historical impact of the Land Rover extended far beyond the specific vehicles used by the SAS in Arabia and Southeast Asia. By the 1970s and 1980s, the basic Land Rover platform had been adopted, in various guises, by the armed forces of more than 70 countries, and its influence can be traced in the design philosophy of numerous later light military vehicles that prioritized simplicity and repairability over sophistication. The Pink Panther variant itself gradually gave way in SAS service to more heavily protected and better armed vehicles during the 1980s and beyond, reflecting the changing nature of the threats faced in later conflicts, yet the lineage remained visible in vehicles that continued to bear the Land Rover name and underlying engineering philosophy well into the 21st century. Several original Pink Panther vehicles survive today in museum collections, including examples held by the Imperial War Museum and by regimental collections associated with the Special Air Service, preserved as physical evidence of a period when British Special Forces doctrine was being written, quite literally, on the move, across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Historians continue to debate the precise number of vehicles converted to the Pink Panther specification, since official records from the period remain incomplete and some details of Dhofar-era operations remain classified or simply unrecorded. But the vehicle's cultural and operational legacy within Special Forces circles is not in dispute. Return, for a moment, to that cold January morning on the gravel plains north of the Dhofar Mountains. The four pink-painted Land Rovers sitting low against the ground were never meant to be remarkable. They began as a compromise, a vehicle built because Britain lacked the steel to build anything grander, sketched by an engineer frustrated with a worn-out farm jeep on a beach in Wales, in a country still rebuilding itself from the wreckage of war. Nobody in 1948 imagined that this practical, unglamorous little truck would one day carry some of the world's most highly trained soldiers across deserts, mountains, and jungles on 4 continents, or that its aluminium panels and simple mechanicals would outlast vehicles designed with vastly greater budgets and ambition. Yet, that is precisely what happened. The Land Rover succeeded not because it was powerful, nor because it was elegant, nor because any general demanded it be built for war. It succeeded because it was honest, because it could be understood and repaired by the very soldiers who depended upon it, and because in the unforgiving landscapes where special forces operate, far from any workshop or supply depot, honesty and simplicity mattered more than any statistic on a specification sheet. The vehicle that began as a stopgap for a nation short of steel became, in the end, a symbol of something enduring about British military engineering, a preference for function over flourish, for reliability over reputation. Soldiers who served in Dhofar, in Malaya, in Aden, and in countless operations that history has recorded only partially, remembered their Land Rovers not as machines, but almost as companions, vehicles that never seemed to fail them even when everything else in the desert conspired to.